The autumn wind carried with it the scent of distant rain, and something else, something that made the horses restless and the men quiet. It was October in the year of our Lord 1097, and the good knight had seen this scent before, in other times, in other wars. It was the smell of a siege about to begin. His silver armor caught the dying light of the Syrian sun as he rode among the vast host of Christian warriors. 20,000 souls, perhaps more, stretched across the valley like a living sea of steel and faith. Banners snapped in the wind, the golden lions of Normandy, the crosses of Toulouse, the eagles of Lorraine. But it was not the banners that held his attention now. It was the city. Antioch rose before them like a vision from another world, its walls climbing impossibly high into the darkening sky. The good knight had witnessed the fall of Troy in ages past, had stood before the gates of Babylon when they gleamed with fresh bronze, but even those legendary fortresses paled before what now lay ahead. The city's Byzantine walls stretched for miles in a rough oval, punctuated by 400 towers that seemed to watch the approaching army with stone eyes. The good knight's destrier shifted beneath him, sensing his rider's tension. Through the slits of his helm he studied those walls, 20 meters tall, 2 meters thick, built to withstand the fury of empires. To the south, the city climbed Mount Silpius itself, where a citadel perched 300 meters above like an eagle's nest, commanding every approach. The western walls dropped directly to the Orontes River, its waters dark and swift in the fading light. "Nigh impregnable," whispered a voice beside him. The good knight turned to see a young knight from Normandy, his face pale beneath his coif. "How does one take such a place?" The good knight said nothing, but his thoughts were heavy. He had seen cities fall before, some by storm, some by treachery, some by the slow grinding of time itself. But this would test them all in ways they could not yet imagine. As the great host began to make camp in the valley below Antioch's walls, the good knight found himself thinking of other sieges, other times when hope had seemed as distant as the stars now beginning to appear in the Syrian sky. He had learned, through centuries of war, that the greatest battles were not always won by the strongest sword or the highest wall. They were won by those who could endure when endurance seemed impossible. The sound of hammers on stakes filled the evening air as the Crusader army established their positions around the city's main gates. Bohemond of Taranto, tall and golden-haired, directed his Normans to the north. Raymond of Toulouse, grizzled and scarred, positioned his Provençals to the south. Godfrey of Bouillon, steady as stone, anchored the center with his Lorrainers. But even as they worked, the good knight could see the problem that would haunt them in the months to come. The city was simply too vast. Their army, impressive as it was, could not hope to encircle those miles of wall completely. Gaps would remain, gaps through which supplies could flow, through which hope could slip away like water through cupped hands. From the walls above, he could see the glint of armor and spear points. Governor Yaosian's garrison was watching, waiting. The good knight had faced Turkish warriors before, in other campaigns, other centuries. They were not men to be underestimated. Swift as wolves, fierce as eagles, they would make the Christians pay for every stone of those walls. As darkness settled over the valley, the good knight made his own camp among the common soldiers. He had learned long ago that the true measure of an army was not found in the pavilions of princes, but around the cooking fires of ordinary men. Here, a blacksmith from Normandy sharpened his sword with steady strokes. There, a farmer from Provence mended his mail with careful fingers. These were the men who would live or die in the months ahead, and their quiet courage humbled him more than any lord's boasting. Think we'll be home by Christmas?" asked the blacksmith, not looking up from his work. "God willing," replied the farmer, though his voice carried little conviction. The good knight listened to their talk, of homes left behind, of families waiting, of the holy city that lay somewhere beyond these walls. They spoke of Jerusalem as if it were a dream made manifest, a place where all their suffering would find meaning. But first they would have to take Antioch. And Antioch, the good knight knew, would take something from each of them in return. The night deepened, and with it came the sounds that would become familiar in the months ahead. The distant calls of sentries on the walls, the restless movement of horses, the whispered prayers of men who sensed the magnitude of what lay before them. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, its voice lonely and strange in this foreign land. The good knight removed his helm and looked up at the stars. They were the same stars that had shone over other battlefields, other sieges, other moments when the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance. But tonight they seemed different somehow, more distant, more cold, as if they too understood that what was about to unfold would test not just the strength of arms, but the very souls of those who dared to challenge these ancient walls. Tomorrow the siege would begin in earnest. Tomorrow they would learn what it truly meant to stand before the gates of Antioch. But tonight, in the quiet darkness, the good knight allowed himself a moment of peace. He thought of other dawns, other battles, other times when hope had seemed as fragile as morning mist. He had survived them all. He would survive this too. But survival, he knew, was not the same as victory. And victory, when it came, might taste more bitter than defeat. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of the city. Stone and smoke, spices and steel. Somewhere beyond those walls, Governor Yao Sayan was making his own preparations, stockpiling food, positioning his men, sending urgent messages to Damascus and Aleppo and Mosul. The Turk was no fool. He knew what was coming. But did any of them, Christian or Muslim, prince or peasant, truly understand what they were about to unleash? The good knight had seen enough of war to know that sieges were crucibles that changed everyone they touched. Men went into them as one thing and came out as another, if they came out at all. As he settled into his bedroll, the good knight's last thought was of the young Norman knight who had spoken of the walls being impregnable. By the time this was over, that young man would learn that the greatest walls were not made of stone, but of hunger and despair, of betrayal and broken faith. Those were the walls that would truly test them in the months ahead. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the dreams and fears of mortal men. And in the city beyond, the first watch of what would become the longest siege of the First Crusade began its lonely vigil. The first light of dawn on October 21st, 1097, revealed the true magnitude of what the Crusaders had undertaken. As the good knight emerged from his tent, he could see the city walls stretching away in both directions, disappearing into morning mist like the spine of some sleeping dragon. The sight was both magnificent and terrible, a testament to the ambition of emperors and the skill of master builders. But it was not the walls that caught his attention first. It was the silence. The great host that had seemed so mighty in the darkness now appeared small and scattered in the vastness of the valley. 20,000 men, spread thin around a city that could have swallowed armies twice their size. The gaps in their lines were obvious now, great spaces where no Christian banner flew, where Turkish horsemen could ride out to strike and fade away like ghosts. The good knight had seen this before, the moment when the reality of a siege settled over an army like a cold shroud. the initial enthusiasm, the dreams of quick victory, all fading in the harsh light of morning. What remained was the slow, grinding work of attrition, of patience, of endurance. Bohemond was already moving among his men, his voice carrying across the camp as he issued orders. The Norman prince was tall and golden, with the kind of presence that made men want to follow him into the very mouth of hell. But the good knight had lived long enough to recognize ambition when he saw it, and Bohemond's ambition burned as bright as his hair. "We'll starve them out," Bohemond was saying to a group of his knights. "Let them eat their stores while we feast on the countryside. Winter will do our work for us." The good knight said nothing, but his thoughts were dark. He had seen what winter could do to a besieging army. Cold and hunger were enemies that showed no mercy to Christian or Turk alike. And this was not the gentle winter of Normandy or Provence. This was Syria, where the rains could turn the earth to marsh, and the winds could cut through mail like knives. As the morning wore on, the Crusaders began their work in earnest. Foraging parties rode out into the surrounding countryside, returning with grain and livestock from abandoned villages. The Turks had withdrawn behind their walls, leaving the land to the Christians, for now. But the good knight could see the wisdom in Governor Yao Xian's strategy. Let the Crusaders spread themselves thin, let them grow comfortable, then strike when they least expected it. The first Turkish sortie came 3 days later. The good knight was with a foraging party near the village of Arta when the attack came. They had been loading grain onto pack animals, the work slow and methodical in the afternoon heat, when the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley. At first it seemed like distant thunder. Then the dust cloud appeared on the horizon, and the good knight knew what was coming. "Form up," shouted the party's leader, a grizzled sergeant from Toulouse. "Spears to the front!" But the Turkish horsemen were already among them, their curved swords flashing in the sunlight. The good knight's destrier reared as a Turkish arrow whistled past his helm, and then he was in the thick of it, his sword singing as it met the enemy's blade. The Turks fought like the wind itself, swift, unpredictable, striking and wheeling away before the Christians could respond. Their horses were smaller than the Crusader destriers, but faster, more agile, bred for this kind of warfare. The good knight found himself admiring their skill even as he fought for his life. A young Turk, barely more than a boy, came at him with a spear. The good knight turned the thrust aside and brought his sword down in a silver arc, but the boy was already gone, wheeling away on his swift pony. This was not the kind of warfare the Crusaders were used to, not the solid clash of heavy cavalry, but something more fluid, more deadly. The attack lasted perhaps an hour, though it felt like a lifetime. When the Turks finally withdrew, they left behind a dozen Christian dead and took with them most of the grain the foraging party had gathered. It was a small victory for Governor Yao Xian, but an important one. It showed the Crusaders that they were not safe, even in the countryside they thought they controlled. As the good knight helped load the wounded onto carts for the journey back to camp, he found himself thinking of the young Turk who had attacked him. There had been something in the boy's eyes, not hatred, but duty. He was defending his home, his faith, his people. In another time, another place, the good knight might have called him brother. But this was war, and war made enemies of men who might otherwise have been friends. The return to camp was somber. Word of the attack spread quickly through the army, and the good knight could see its effect on the men's faces. The easy confidence of the first days was gone, replaced by something harder, more wary. They were beginning to understand what kind of enemy they faced. That night, as the good knight sat by his fire cleaning his sword, a young knight approached. It was the same Norman who had spoken of the walls being impregnable, but his face was different now, older somehow, marked by the reality of what they had undertaken. "They say there will be more attacks," the young man said, settling beside the fire. "There will be," the good knight replied, not looking up from his blade. "How do you know?" The good knight paused in his work, considering the question. How could he explain that he had seen this pattern before, in other sieges, other wars? That he had learned to read the signs, the way an enemy tested your strength, probed for weakness, prepared for the long struggle ahead, because that is what I would do, he said finally. The young knight was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "Will we take the city?" It was the question that haunted every man in the camp, though few dared voice it. The good knight had no easy answer. He had seen mighty cities fall and weak ones endure. He had witnessed the triumph of faith and the victory of despair. In the end, it came down to will. Who wanted it more? Who could endure longer? Who could pay the higher price? "That depends," he said, "on what we are willing to sacrifice." The young knight nodded, though the good knight doubted he truly understood. Not yet. But he would, in time. They all would. The Siege of Antioch would teach them lessons they had never wanted to learn, show them truths they had never wanted to see. As the fire burned low and the camp settled into uneasy sleep, the good knight found himself thinking of the months ahead. Winter was coming, and with it would come hunger and cold and the slow erosion of hope. Men would die, not in glorious battle, but from disease and starvation and the simple, grinding despair of a siege that seemed to have no end. But they would endure. They had to. Because beyond these walls lay the road to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was the dream that had brought them all so far from home. The good knight closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his dreams were filled with the sound of Turkish hoofbeats and the glint of curved swords in the Syrian sun. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called again, its voice a lonely reminder that they were strangers in a strange land, far from everything they had ever known. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of faith and endurance. But tonight, in the quiet darkness, the good knight allowed himself to remember other dawns, other battles, other times when hope had seemed as distant as the stars. He had survived them all. He would survive this too. But survival, he was beginning to understand, might be the hardest victory of all. Chapter 2. The grinding wheel of winter November brought with it the first taste of what was to come. The good knight woke one morning to find his breath misting in the cold air, and when he stepped outside his tent, the ground crunched beneath his feet with the first frost of the Syrian winter. Around him, the great Crusader camp was stirring to life. But there was something different in the air, a tension that had not been there in the early days of the siege. The foraging had grown more difficult. Governor Yarsiyan's strategy was working. His horsemen struck like lightning whenever the Christians ventured too far from their camps, and the countryside that had once seemed so abundant was now picked clean. The good knight had ridden out with 3 foraging parties in the past week, and each had returned with less than the one before. It was during one of these expeditions that he first saw the signs of what was coming. They had traveled nearly 10 miles from Antioch, farther than any party had dared go before, searching for grain in a village that scouts reported was still untouched. But when they arrived, they found only empty houses and barren fields. The Turks had been there first. "Nothing?" reported the sergeant leading the party, a weathered man from Normandy named Fulk. "Not so much as a grain of wheat." The good knight dismounted and walked through the abandoned village, his silver armor catching the pale winter sun. The houses were intact but empty, their doors standing open like mouths frozen in silent screams. In one courtyard, he found the remains of a cooking fire, still warm. They had missed the villagers by hours, perhaps less, but it was not the empty houses that troubled him most. It was the silence. No birds sang in the bare trees, no dogs barked in the distance. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the very land was holding its breath. "Sir Knight," called one of the men-at-arms, his voice tight with concern. "You should see this." The good knight followed the man to the village well. Peering down into its depths, he could see why the man was troubled. The water was fouled, deliberately poisoned with the carcass of a goat. It was a message from Governor Yausian, as clear as if he had written it in letters of fire. "You will find nothing here, nothing but death." The ride back to camp was quiet, each man lost in his own thoughts. The good knight found himself thinking of other sieges, other times when the slow strangulation of supply lines had decided the fate of armies. He had seen proud hosts reduced to eating leather and grass, had watched as discipline crumbled under the weight of empty bellies. But it was not just the lack of food that worried him. It was what he saw in the faces of the men around him, the first flickering shadows of doubt. That evening, as the good knight made his rounds through the camp, he could see the changes that a month of siege had wrought. The tents that had once stood proud and tall now sagged under the weight of accumulated rain and frost. The horses, once sleek and well-fed, were growing thin despite their riders' best efforts. And the men were beginning to look like what they were becoming. Not the glorious army of God they had imagined themselves to be, but a collection of cold, hungry, increasingly desperate souls trapped between an impregnable city and a hostile countryside. He paused at one campfire where a group of Provençal knights sat in sullen silence, their meal a thin gruel that would have shamed a peasant's table. One of them, a young man with the soft hands of nobility, stared into his bowl as if it contained all the sorrows of the world. "My lord promised us we would feast in Antioch by All Saints' Day," the young knight said to no one in particular. All Saints' Day was a week ago. An older knight, his face scarred by some long-ago battle, spat into the fire. "Lords promise many things. The keeping of promises is another matter." The good knight moved on, but the conversation followed him like a shadow. He had heard similar words around other fires, seen the same doubt in other eyes. The army was still strong, still disciplined, but cracks were beginning to show. And winter had barely begun. The first real test came in early December, when the rains arrived. The good knight had experienced Syrian winters before, in other centuries, but he had forgotten their particular cruelty. The rain did not fall gently, as it might in France or England. It came in torrents that turned the ground to mud, and the air to a cold, grey shroud that seemed to press down on the camp like the weight of God's displeasure. Within days, the lowlands around Antioch had become a marsh. Tents collapsed under the weight of water. Equipment rusted despite the best efforts of armorers. And the smell of rotting canvas and unwashed bodies, and the latrines that overflowed with each new downpour, became a constant presence that no amount of incense could mask. But worse than the physical discomfort was what the rain did to the men's spirits. The good knight watched as knights who had charged fearlessly into Turkish arrows now huddled in their sodden tents, staring at nothing with the hollow eyes of men who had begun to question everything they had once believed. It was during one of these grey, endless days that the sickness came. The good knight first noticed it among the camp followers, the women and children and old men who had followed the army from Europe. driven by faith or desperation or simple hope for a better life. They began to fall ill with a fever that burned like fire and left its victims weak as newborn lambs. Within a week, the sickness had spread to the soldiers themselves. He found himself thinking of other plagues he had witnessed, other times when disease had stalked through armies like an invisible enemy, more deadly than any sword. But knowing what was coming did not make it easier to watch. Each morning brought new graves, new faces missing from the ranks, new reminders of their mortality. The GoodKnight did what he could. He helped carry the sick to the physicians' tents, though there was little the learned men could do beyond bleeding and prayer. He assisted in digging graves when the ground was soft enough to accept them. He spoke words of comfort to dying men, though he wondered sometimes if his own faith was strong enough to sustain such gestures. It was during one of these grim duties that he encountered Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate who served as the army's spiritual leader. The bishop was kneeling beside a dying knight, administering the last rites with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation as a warrior priest. "Do you think God has abandoned us?" The dying knight whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of rain on canvas. Adhemar's response was immediate and firm. "God does not abandon those who serve him faithfully. This is a test, my son, a trial to purify our souls for the work ahead." But the GoodKnight, watching from the shadows, saw something in the bishop's eyes that his words did not convey. Doubt. Fear. The same questions that haunted every man in the camp, dressed in the robes of authority but no less real for their disguise. After the knight had breathed his last, Adhemar rose slowly, his joints stiff from kneeling on the cold ground. He noticed the GoodKnight watching and approached, his face grave. "You have seen much death, I think," the bishop said. It was not a question. "More than I care to remember, Your Grace." Adhemar nodded, studying the GoodKnight's silver armor with curious eyes. "And yet you continue to fight. Why?" It was a question the GoodKnight had asked himself many times over the centuries. Why did he continue? What drove him from battle to battle, siege to siege, always surviving when so many others fell? "Because someone must," he said finally. "Because the alternative is to surrender to despair." The bishop was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain drumming against the tent walls. "Sometimes," he said softly, "I wonder if despair might not be the more honest choice." It was a shocking admission from a man whose duty was to inspire faith, but the GoodKnight understood. He had felt the same way himself, in other dark times, other moments when hope seemed as distant as the stars. But he had learned something that perhaps the bishop had not yet discovered, that faith was not the absence of doubt, but the decision to continue despite it. "Doubt is not sin, Your Grace," the GoodKnight said gently. "It is the price of thinking clearly." Adhemar looked at him sharply, as if seeing him for the first time. "You speak strangely for a simple knight." "I have had time to think, Your Grace, more time than most." The bishop nodded slowly, then turned to go, but at the tent flap he paused. "Pray for us," he said. "Pray that we have the strength to see this through." After he was gone, the GoodKnight remained in the tent with the dead knight, listening to the rain and thinking of all the prayers he had heard over the centuries. Prayers for victory, prayers for peace, prayers for simple survival. He wondered sometimes if God grew weary of such petitions, if the Almighty looked down on the endless cycle of human conflict with something approaching despair. But such thoughts were dangerous, especially in times like these. Faith, however fragile, was often all that stood between an army and complete collapse. And this army, the good knight could see, was balanced on the very edge of that precipice. The proof came on December 29th, when Governor Yarsian launched his most ambitious sortie yet. The good knight was in Count Raymond's section of the camp when the attack came. He had been helping to repair a collapsed tent when the sound of war horns echoed across the valley, followed immediately by the thunder of hoofbeats and the clash of steel on steel. The Turkish assault was perfectly timed. They struck just as the Christians were settling down to their meager evening meal, when guards were changing and attention was focused inward rather than on the walls of the city. Yarsian himself led the charge, his banner flying above a force of nearly 1,000 horsemen. The good knight barely had time to don his helm before the enemy was among them. A Turkish lancer came at him out of the gathering dusk, his spear point gleaming like a fallen star. The good knight turned his destrier at the last moment, feeling the spear point scrape along his shoulder guard, then brought his sword around in a silver arc that took the Turk from his saddle. But even as that enemy fell, 2 more took his place. The camp was in chaos, men running in all directions, some toward the fighting, others away from it. Tents burned where Turkish fire arrows had found their mark, and the smoke mixed with the evening mist to create a hellish twilight that made friend and foe almost impossible to distinguish. The good knight found himself fighting beside a young sergeant from Provence, a man he had never seen before, but who wielded his sword with the desperate skill of someone who knew his life depended on every stroke. Together they held a small section of the camp against wave after wave of Turkish attackers, their blades singing in the smoky air. "Where did they come from?" the sergeant gasped during a brief lull in the fighting. "The Dog Bridge," the good knight replied, pointing toward the river. "They must have crossed there. It was a tactical masterstroke by Yarsian. The Crusaders had tried repeatedly to destroy the bridge that connected the city to the north bank of the Orontes, but the Turks had always managed to repair it. Now it had served its purpose, allowing the governor to strike deep into the heart of the Christian camp. The battle raged for nearly 2 hours before the Turks finally withdrew, melting back into the darkness as suddenly as they had appeared. They left behind a scene of devastation that would haunt the good knight's dreams for nights to come. Dozens of tents lay in ruins. Supplies that the army could ill afford to lose had been destroyed or carried off. And scattered among the wreckage were the bodies of men who had survived the long march from Europe, only to die in the mud of a Syrian winter. As dawn broke over the camp, the good knight helped with the grim work of counting the dead and assessing the damage. The losses were not catastrophic in purely military terms, perhaps 50 men killed, twice that number wounded. But the psychological impact was devastating. The attack had shattered the illusion of safety that the camp had provided, reminding every man that they were surrounded by enemies who could strike at will. More troubling still were the signs of what the prolonged siege was doing to the army's discipline. The good knight saw knights arguing over scraps of food, men-at-arms deserting their posts to search for better shelter, and everywhere the hollow-eyed look of soldiers who had begun to lose faith in their cause. It was then, in the grey light of that December morning, that the good knight first heard the whispers that would grow louder in the weeks to come. Whispers of home, of warm hearths and full bellies. Whispers of doubt about the wisdom of their enterprise. And most dangerous of all, whispers of retreat. The Siege of Antioch had become something none of them had expected when they first saw those mighty walls rising from the Syrian plain. It had become a test not just of military skill, but of the human spirit itself. And as winter tightened its grip on the valley, the good knight wondered how many of them would prove strong enough to pass that test. The answer, he suspected, would come sooner than any of them wished. January brought with it a cold that seemed to seep into men's very bones. The GoodKnight had experienced many winters in many lands, but there was something particularly cruel about this Syrian cold, sharp and cutting, made worse by the constant dampness that rose from the marshy ground around their camp. He watched as knights who had once stood proud in their mail now huddled around smoking fires, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air. But it was not the cold that truly tested them. It was the hunger. The GoodKnight first truly understood the depth of their predicament when he joined a foraging party led by Bohemond himself. The Norman prince had grown gaunt in the months since the siege began, his golden hair now lank, and his eyes holding a hardness that had not been there in the autumn. They rode out before dawn, 20 knights and twice as many men-at-arms, searching for anything edible in a countryside that had been picked clean months ago. "There," Bohemond said, pointing toward a distant village. "The scouts report smoke. Where there is smoke, there might be food." But when they reached the village, they found only disappointment. The smoke came from a single house, where an old Syrian woman sat beside a meager fire, her eyes wide with terror at the sight of armed Crusaders. Her entire store of food consisted of a handful of barley and a few dried figs, barely enough to feed one person for a day, let alone 20 hungry knights. Bohemond stared at the pitiful offering for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing something bitter. The GoodKnight could see the war raging behind the prince's eyes, the struggle between his noble upbringing and the desperate hunger that gnawed at them all. "Take it," Bohemond said finally, his voice flat. "My lord," one of his knights protested, "surely we cannot—" "Take it," Bohemond repeated, and there was something in his tone that brooked no argument. The GoodKnight watched as the woman's meager stores were loaded onto their pack animals, saw the tears streaming down her weathered face, heard her whispered prayers in a language he did not understand, but whose meaning was universal. This was what they had become, not the glorious army of God they had imagined themselves to be, but desperate men taking food from the mouths of the innocent. The ride back to camp was conducted in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. The GoodKnight found himself thinking of other times, other armies he had served with, other moments when necessity had forced good men to do things that would haunt their dreams. War, he had learned, was not just about the clash of swords and the thunder of hoofbeats. It was about the slow erosion of everything that made men human. When they returned to camp, they found it in an uproar. Word had spread that Dukak of Damascus was approaching with a relief army. 10,000 men, according to the scouts, all of them fresh and well-fed and eager to lift the siege. The contrast with their own condition could not have been more stark. The GoodKnight could see the effect of this news on the faces around him. Some men looked relieved, as if the prospect of battle, even a battle they might lose, was preferable to the slow starvation they had been enduring. Others looked terrified, knowing that in their weakened state, they would be poor match for a fresh enemy army. But it was the third group that worried him most. The men whose faces showed nothing at all, who had retreated so far into themselves that they seemed to be watching events from a great distance. These were the men who had begun to break under the strain, and the GoodKnight knew from experience that broken men were more dangerous than any enemy army. The battle, when it came on December 31st, was unlike anything the GoodKnight had experienced in all his centuries of warfare, not because of its scale or its ferocity, but because of what it revealed about what they had all become. He rode out with Bohemond and Robert of Flanders, part of a force that was supposed to intercept Dukak's army before it could reach Antioch. But as they approached the village of Albara, where the enemy had been sighted, The good knight could feel the weakness in their ranks like a physical presence. Horses stumbled from lack of proper feed. Knights swayed in their saddles from hunger and exhaustion. The very air seemed to vibrate with desperation. When they finally encountered Dukak's forces, the contrast was immediately apparent. The Damascus troops were well equipped and well fed, their horses sleek and their weapons gleaming in the winter sun. They moved with the confidence of men who had not spent months slowly starving in the Syrian mud. The good knight found himself facing a young Turkish emir whose armor was so polished it seemed to glow. The man's horse danced beneath him with barely contained energy, while the good knight's own destrier could barely manage more than a tired trot. It was a perfect metaphor for the entire engagement, fresh strength against desperate endurance. The battle itself was a confused affair, fought in the narrow spaces between houses and olive groves where cavalry could not maneuver effectively. The good knight lost sight of the larger tactical picture almost immediately, his world narrowing to the immediate threats around him. A spear thrust from his left, an arrow whistling past his helm, the constant need to keep his exhausted horse moving. He found himself fighting beside a knight from Toulouse, whose name he had never learned, a man whose face was so gaunt that his cheekbones stood out like knife edges. Together they held a small courtyard against a group of Turkish infantry, their swords moving in the mechanical rhythm of men who had learned to fight despite their exhaustion. "Can't much longer," the Toulouse knight gasped during a brief lull. The good knight knew what he meant. They were all running on empty, sustained only by desperation and the knowledge that defeat meant death. But somehow, impossibly, they held. Not through superior skill or better tactics, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to give up that was perhaps the only advantage they still possessed. When Dukak's forces finally withdrew, it was not because they had been defeated in any conventional sense. It was because the weather had turned even worse, bringing with it a storm that made further fighting impossible. The Turks retreated to Hama, and from there back to Damascus, leaving the field to the Crusaders by default. But victory, the good knight realized as he surveyed the aftermath, was a relative term. They had prevented Dukak from relieving Antioch, but at a cost they could ill afford. More men dead, more horses lost, more equipment damaged or destroyed. And worst of all, the food they had been trying to gather during the expedition had been scattered or spoiled in the fighting. The march back to camp was a nightmare of cold and exhaustion. The good knight watched as men who had fought bravely just hours before now stumbled through the mud like walking corpses, their eyes vacant and their movements mechanical. Some simply collapsed and had to be carried by their comrades. Others wandered off into the darkness and were never seen again. It was during this grim procession that the good knight first heard the word that would haunt the camp in the weeks to come. Cannibalism. It started as a whisper, passed from man to man in the darkness. Stories of desperate soldiers eating the flesh of dead horses, then of dead Turks, and finally, most horrible of all, of their own fallen comrades. The good knight wanted to dismiss these tales as the fevered imaginings of starving men, but he had seen enough of human nature to know that desperation could drive people to unimaginable extremes. The proof came a few days later, when he discovered a group of camp followers huddled around a fire in a secluded part of the camp. At first glance, it seemed like any other gathering of cold, hungry people trying to warm themselves. But then the good knight saw what was cooking in their pot, and his blood turned to ice. He said nothing, did nothing. What was there to say? What was there to do? These were not evil people, but desperate ones, driven to the very edge of human endurance. To condemn them would be to condemn them all, for who among them had not felt the same gnawing hunger, the same creeping despair? Instead, he turned away and walked back to his own fire, where he sat staring into the flames and thinking of all the things he had seen in his long existence. He had witnessed the fall of empires and the rise of kingdoms. He had seen saints and sinners, heroes and cowards, the best and worst of human nature. But this slow dissolution of everything that made men human, was perhaps the most terrible thing of all. It was then, in the depths of that January night, that the good knight began to understand what the Siege of Antioch was truly about. It was not just a military campaign or even a test of faith. It was a crucible, a place where souls were refined or destroyed, where men discovered what they were truly made of when everything else was stripped away. Some, he knew, would emerge from this crucible stronger than before, their faith and courage purified by suffering. Others would be broken by it, their spirits shattered beyond repair. And still others, perhaps the majority, would simply endure, carrying the scars of this experience with them for the rest of their lives. As for himself, the good knight was not sure which category he fell into. He had survived other crucibles, other tests of endurance and faith. But this one felt different somehow, more personal, more complete in its assault on everything he had once believed about honor and nobility and the nature of war itself. The fire burned low, and around him the camp settled into the uneasy sleep of men who knew that tomorrow would bring only more of the same. More hunger, more cold, more of the slow grinding away of hope. But the good knight remained awake, staring into the dying embers and thinking of the young Norman knight who had asked him, so long ago it seemed, whether they would take the city. The question now was not whether they would take Antioch, but whether there would be anything left of them worth saving when they did. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to echo the despair in every man's heart. The good knight pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders and tried not to think about what the morning would bring. But morning always came, whether men were ready for it or not. And with it would come new tests, new challenges, new opportunities to discover just how far good men could fall when pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The Siege of Antioch was far from over. In many ways, the good knight realized it had barely begun. February arrived with the deceptive promise of spring. The bitter cold that had gripped the valley began to ease, and for a few precious days, the sun actually broke through the perpetual grey clouds that had shrouded their camp for months. The good knight watched as men emerged from their sodden tents like creatures crawling from caves, blinking in the unaccustomed light, and daring to hope that perhaps the worst was behind them. They were wrong. The first sign of the new crisis came with the arrival of scouts from the north, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with news that would shake the very foundations of the Crusader army. Ridwan of Aleppo was marching south with 12,000 men, fresh troops, well supplied, and burning with the desire to avenge Dukak's earlier defeat. The good knight was present when the scouts delivered their report to the assembled princes in Bohemont's pavilion. The great tent, which had once been a symbol of Norman wealth and power, now seemed shabby and worn, its silk hangings stained with months of rain and smoke. The princes themselves looked little better, gaunt, hollow-eyed men who bore little resemblance to the proud lords who had set out from Constantinople the previous year. 12,000, Raymond of Toulouse repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. And we can barely muster half that number fit for battle. Bohemond leaned forward in his chair, his golden hair now streaked with premature grey. Then we must strike first, before they can unite with the garrison." "With what?" Godfrey of Bouillon asked, his usually steady voice cracking with exhaustion. "Half our horses are dead, and the other half can barely carry their riders. Our men are so weak they can hardly lift their swords." The good knight watched this exchange with growing unease. These were the leaders upon whom the entire crusade depended, and he could see the cracks beginning to show in their unity. Months of shared hardship had not brought them closer together as he had hoped it might. Instead, it had revealed the fundamental differences in their characters, the competing ambitions that had been hidden beneath the veneer of common purpose. It was then that Tatikios, the Byzantine advisor who had accompanied them from Constantinople, spoke up. His voice was calm and measured, but the good knight could hear the underlying tension in his words. "Perhaps," Tatikios said carefully, "it is time to consider a strategic withdrawal. We could fall back to retreat." Bohemon's voice cut through the tent like a blade. "You speak of retreat." "I speak of survival," Tatikios replied, his dark eyes meeting Bohemon's blue ones without flinching. "What good will it do the Emperor if we all die here in the mud?" The good knight saw something flicker across Bohemon's face, a look of calculation that he had learned to recognize over the centuries. The Norman prince was thinking, weighing options, considering possibilities that went far beyond the immediate tactical situation. "The Emperor," Bohemond said slowly, "seems very far away from here." It was a simple statement, but the good knight understood its implications immediately. The bonds that had held the Crusader army together, their oaths to Alexios, their shared commitment to returning conquered territories to the Byzantine Empire, were beginning to fray under the pressure of their desperate circumstances. The meeting broke up without any clear resolution, the princes dispersing to their own camps to prepare for whatever was to come. But the good knight lingered, watching as Tatikios gathered his papers with hands that trembled slightly. The Byzantine advisor looked older than his years, worn down by months of trying to hold together an alliance that was coming apart at the seams. "You are troubled," the good knight observed. Tatikios looked up, startled. He had not noticed the good knight's presence, so absorbed had he been in his own thoughts. "Shouldn't I be?" Tatikios replied. "I came here to advise, to help coordinate between the Crusader army and the Empire, but I fear I am becoming more of a liability than an asset." The good knight nodded slowly. He had seen this pattern before, the way alliances crumbled under pressure, the way desperate men began to look for scapegoats to blame for their misfortunes. Tatikios, as the representative of a distant emperor, made a convenient target for frustrations that had been building for months. "Bohemond means to have Antioch for himself," the good knight said quietly. It was not a question, and Tatikios did not treat it as one. "I know," he said. "The question is whether he will be content to simply break his oath to the Emperor, or whether he will take more direct action." The answer came sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, the good knight was awakened before dawn by the sound of raised voices outside his tent. He emerged to find the camp in an uproar, men running back and forth with the frantic energy of a disturbed ant-hill. It took him several minutes to piece together what had happened from the confused reports he was hearing. Tatikios was gone. The Byzantine advisor had departed in the night, taking with him his small retinue of Greek soldiers and leaving behind only a brief message explaining that he had been recalled to Constantinople on urgent business. But the timing of his departure, just days before the expected battle with Ridwan's army, made his true motivations clear to everyone. the good knight found Bohemond holding court near the center of the camp, surrounded by a crowd of knights and men-at-arms who hung on his every word. The Norman prince's face was a mask of righteous indignation as he spoke of betrayal and cowardice, of allies who abandoned their comrades in their hour of greatest need. "He threatened to kill me," Bohemond was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "Said that if I did not yield command to him, he would see to it that I never left Syria alive. What choice did I have but to defend myself?" The good knight listened to this performance with growing disgust. He had been present at the meeting where Tatikios had spoken of withdrawal, had seen the fear in the man's eyes, not fear of battle, but fear of the political machinations that were tearing the army apart. Bohemond's version of events was a masterful piece of theatre, designed to absolve the Crusaders of their oaths to the Byzantine emperor while painting the departed advisor as a villain. But what troubled the good knight most was not Bohemond's lies — he had heard plenty of those over the centuries — but the eagerness with which the crowd accepted them. These men wanted to believe that they had been betrayed, wanted an excuse to abandon the complicated web of obligations that had bound them to Constantinople. Bohemond was simply giving them what they wanted to hear. "We are free now," Bohemond continued, his voice rising to a crescendo. "Free to fight this war as it should be fought, without the interference of those who would use us for their own ends. When we take Antioch, and we will take it, it will be ours by right of conquest, not by the grace of some distant emperor who has never shed a drop of blood for this cause." The crowd roared its approval, but the good knight noticed that not everyone was cheering. Raymond of Toulouse stood at the edge of the gathering, his face dark with anger. Godfrey of Bouillon looked troubled, as if he understood the implications of what Bohemond was proposing, but was not sure how to respond. And scattered throughout the crowd were other faces that reflected doubt, concern, even fear at the path they were being asked to take. The army was fracturing. The good knight realized. The shared hardships that should have bound them together were instead driving them apart, revealing the fundamental contradictions that had been present from the beginning. Some men still believed in the original vision of the Crusade, a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom. Others had begun to see it as an opportunity for personal gain, a chance to carve out kingdoms in the East. And still others simply wanted to survive, to find some way out of the nightmare they had stumbled into. The battle with Ridwan's army, when it came on February 9th, reflected these divisions in ways that would have been comical if they had not been so tragic. The good knight rode out with the advance guard, part of a force that was supposed to intercept the Aleppo army before it could reach Antioch. But as they approached the iron bridge where Ridwan's forces had been sighted, he could see that their own army was barely holding together. Knights rode in loose formations, their attention focused more on their own survival than on coordinated tactics. Men-at-arms struggled to keep up with their mounted superiors, their faces grey with exhaustion and malnutrition. When they finally encountered Ridwan's forces, the contrast was even more stark than it had been with Dukak's army. The Aleppo troops were not just well-fed and well-equipped, they were confident, moving with the easy assurance of men who expected to win. Their horses pranced and snorted in the morning air, while the Crusader mounts could barely manage a steady walk. The good knight found himself in the front rank as the two armies closed, his silver armor catching the early morning sun. Beside him rode a young knight from Normandy, not the same one who had questioned him about the walls of Antioch, but another like him, full of desperate courage and fading hope. "Will we win?" the young man asked, his voice barely audible above the thunder of hoofbeats. The good knight looked ahead at the approaching enemy line, at the forest of spear points and the glint of curved swords, and tried to find an honest answer. They were outnumbered, outfed, and outfought. By any rational calculation, they should be slaughtered. "We will endure," he said finally. "That is all any of us can do." The charge, when it came, was unlike anything the good knight had experienced in all his centuries of warfare. Not because of its violence, he had seen plenty of that, but because of its desperation. These were not knights riding to glory, but desperate men making what might be their last stand against an enemy that represented everything they had lost: strength, confidence, hope itself. The good knight's lance took a Turkish horseman in the chest, the impact nearly unseating him from his exhausted destrier. Around him, the battle dissolved into the familiar chaos of individual combats, each man fighting his own private war against death and defeat. He found himself facing a Turkish emir whose armor was inlaid with gold and whose horse moved like liquid lightning beneath him. The man's scimitar whistled through the air with deadly precision, and the good knight had to use every trick he had learned over the centuries just to stay alive. His own sword felt heavy in his hands, his movements sluggish compared to his opponent's fluid grace. But then something unexpected happened. The Turkish line, which had seemed so solid and confident just moments before, began to waver. Not because of any tactical brilliance on the part of the Crusaders, but because of something far simpler and more fundamental: the sheer stubborn refusal of desperate men to give up. The good knight saw it first in the eyes of the emir he was fighting. A flicker of uncertainty, a moment of doubt. The man had expected to face a broken army, demoralized troops who would flee at the first sign of serious resistance. Instead, he found himself confronting men who fought with the fury of the damned, who had nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing to fear. The psychological effect spread through the Turkish ranks like wildfire. These were men who had come expecting an easy victory, a chance to drive the weakened Crusaders back into the sea. They were not prepared for the kind of desperate, all-or-nothing resistance they encountered. When their initial charge failed to break the Christian line, doubt began to creep in. When the Crusaders actually began to push back, doubt turned to fear. The rout, when it came, was sudden and complete. One moment the Turkish army was a disciplined force advancing to certain victory. The next, it was a mob of fleeing horsemen, their confidence shattered by the unexpected resilience of their supposedly beaten enemies. The good knight watched them go, with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They had won, but it felt more like a reprieve than a victory. The enemy was gone, but the fundamental problems that plagued the Crusader army remained. They were still starving, still divided, still trapped before the walls of an impregnable city. As he rode back toward camp, the good knight found himself thinking about what he had witnessed in the battle. The Turkish defeat had not been caused by superior tactics or better equipment. It had been caused by the collision between expectation and reality. The shock of discovering that desperate men could be more dangerous than confident ones. But he also understood that such victories were fragile things, dependent on circumstances that could not be relied upon to repeat themselves. The next enemy army they faced might not be so easily discouraged. The next battle might not end so favorably, and even if it did, the good knight wondered how many more such victories the Crusader army could survive. Each battle, even a successful one, cost them men and horses and equipment they could not afford to lose. Each victory brought them closer to the point where victory and defeat would become indistinguishable. The camp that greeted their return was a study in contrasts. Men cheered their success and celebrated their survival, but the good knight could see the underlying fragility in their joy. These were not the celebrations of a confident army, but the desperate revelry of men who knew that each victory might be their last. As night fell over the valley, the good knight sat by his fire, and tried to make sense of what he had witnessed. The Siege of Antioch was changing them all, stripping away the illusions and pretenses that had sustained them through the early months of the campaign. What remained was something harder and more desperate, but also more honest in its way. They were no longer the glorious army of God they had imagined themselves to be. They were simply men, pushed to the very limits of human endurance, discovering what they were truly made of when everything else was taken away. Some would break under the pressure. Others would find reserves of strength they had never known they possessed. And a few, like the GoodKnight himself, would simply endure, carrying the weight of their experiences like scars that would never fully heal. The fire burned low, and around him the camp settled into the uneasy sleep of men who knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their resolve. But the GoodKnight remained awake, staring into the dying embers and thinking of all the battles yet to come. The Siege of Antioch was far from over, and with each passing day, he was beginning to understand that the greatest enemy they faced was not the Turkish garrison behind those mighty walls, but the slow dissolution of everything that had once held them together as an army and as men. March brought with it a different kind of torment. The physical hardships remained, the hunger, the cold, the constant threat of disease. But now they were joined by something perhaps more dangerous, the slow poison of political intrigue that began to seep through the army like a plague. The GoodKnight first became aware of the depth of the problem during a chance encounter with Raymond of Toulouse. He had been making his evening rounds through the camp when he came upon the Count sitting alone outside his pavilion, staring at the walls of Antioch with an expression of profound weariness. "May I join you, my lord?" the GoodKnight asked. Raymond looked up, his eyes taking a moment to focus. The Count had aged visibly in the months since the siege began, his hair now more grey than brown, his face deeply lined with the weight of command and constant worry. "Of course," Raymond said, gesturing to a camp stool beside him, "though I fear I am poor company these days." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two men who had seen enough of war to understand that sometimes words were unnecessary. The walls of Antioch loomed before them in the gathering dusk, as imposing as ever, their stones seeming to mock the efforts of the army that had spent so many months trying to breach them. "He means to have it for himself," Raymond said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. The GoodKnight didn't need to ask who he was. Bohemon's ambitions had become increasingly obvious in the weeks since Tatikios's departure, his claims about Byzantine betrayal serving as convenient justification for abandoning the oaths they had all sworn in Constantinople. "The city?" the GoodKnight asked. "The city, the principality, perhaps more if he can manage it." Raymond's voice carried a bitterness that the GoodKnight had not heard before. "He has been working on the other princes one by one, promises to some, threats to others. He is very skilled at finding what each man wants most and offering it to him." The GoodKnight nodded slowly. He had observed Bohemon's maneuvering with the detached interest of someone who had witnessed similar political games played out across the centuries. The Norman prince was indeed skilled, perhaps more skilled than any of his rivals realized. "And what does he offer you, my lord?" Raymond laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Nothing. He knows I cannot be bought or frightened, so instead he seeks to isolate me, to make me appear unreasonable, stubborn, an obstacle to the army's success." "Is it working?" "Look around you," Raymond said, gesturing toward the scattered campfires that dotted the valley. "How many men do you see gathering around my banner these days? How many knights seek my counsel? Bohemond has convinced them that I am the problem, that my insistence on honoring our oaths to the Emperor is what stands between them and victory. The good knight could see the truth of this in the Count's isolation. Where once Raymond's pavilion had been a center of activity, a place where knights and nobles gathered to seek his wisdom and guidance, now it stood largely empty. The political currents of the army had shifted, leaving the Count stranded like a ship abandoned by the tide. "What will you do?" the good knight asked. Raymond was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant walls. "What can I do? I am one man against a tide of ambition and desperation. If I oppose Bohemond too openly, I risk splitting the army at the very moment when we need unity most. If I remain silent, I become complicit in the betrayal of everything we swore to uphold." It was a dilemma that the good knight recognized from other times, other conflicts. The choice between principle and pragmatism, between honor and survival. He had seen good men destroyed by such choices, and he had seen others compromise their souls in the name of the greater good. "Perhaps," the good knight said carefully, "the question is not what you will do, but what you can live with afterward." Raymond looked at him sharply, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You speak strangely for a simple knight. There is something about you, something that suggests you have faced such choices before." The good knight said nothing, but Raymond seemed to take his silence as confirmation. "Yes," the Count said slowly. "I thought so. Well then, you understand the weight of what I carry. The knowledge that whatever I choose, men will die because of it. The question is whether they will die for something worthwhile, or merely to feed one man's ambition." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, a young squire who approached with the nervous energy of someone bearing unwelcome news. "My lord," the boy said, bowing deeply to Raymond. "Prince Bohemond requests your presence at a council of war. He says it is urgent." Raymond sighed and rose from his stool, his movements those of a man carrying a great weight. "It begins," he said to the good knight. "Whatever Bohemond has planned, he is ready to set it in motion." The council was held in Bohemond's pavilion, and the good knight was surprised to find himself included among the attendees. Perhaps his conversation with Raymond had been observed, or perhaps Bohemond simply wanted as many witnesses as possible for whatever he was about to propose. Either way, the good knight found himself standing at the back of the tent, watching as the drama unfolded. The assembled princes looked like shadows of their former selves. Godfrey of Bouillon, once the very image of knightly virtue, now appeared hollow-eyed and gaunt. Tancred, Bohemond's nephew, fidgeted nervously with his sword hilt. Even the lesser nobles who filled out the gathering seemed diminished, worn down by months of hardship and uncertainty. Bohemond himself, however, seemed to have found new energy. He stood at the center of the tent like an actor on a stage, his golden hair catching the light of the oil lamps, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from absolute confidence in one's own righteousness. "My lords," he began, his voice filling the tent, "I have called you here because we face a crisis that threatens not just our mission, but our very survival. Word has reached me that Kerbogha of Mosul is gathering an army, the largest force we have yet faced. 40,000 men, perhaps more, all of them fresh and eager to drive us into the sea." A murmur ran through the assembled nobles. The name of Kerbogha was known to them all, the most powerful of the Seljuk emirs, a man whose reputation for military skill was matched only by his ruthlessness. "We cannot face such a force in our current condition," Bohemond continued. "Half our men are too weak to fight, and the other half are barely better. Our horses are dying, our supplies are exhausted, and our morale—" He let the sentence hang in the air, allowing each man to fill in the obvious conclusion. "What do you propose?" Godfrey asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bohemond smiled, and the good knight felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen that smile before, on other faces, in other times. It was the smile of a man who had found a way to turn disaster to his advantage. "I propose that we take Antioch before Kerbogha arrives," Bohemond said simply. The tent erupted in voices, some incredulous, others excited, all of them desperate for any solution that offered hope of escape from their current predicament. "How?" Raymond's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "We have been trying to take the city for months. What has changed?" Bohemond's smile widened. "I have been in communication with certain sympathetic elements within the city. There are those who would see the current regime fall, who would welcome Christian rule if it meant an end to the suffering of their people." The good knight felt his blood turn cold. He had heard such claims before, had seen how desperate commanders could convince themselves that treachery was merely pragmatism, that betrayal was simply another tool of war. "You speak of betrayal," Raymond said, his voice heavy with disgust. "I speak of opportunity," Bohemond replied smoothly. "Of the chance to achieve our goals without the senseless slaughter that a direct assault would require. Surely that is preferable to watching our army slowly starve to death in this valley." The debate that followed was fierce, but brief. The other princes, worn down by months of hardship and terrified by the prospect of facing Kerbogha's massive army, were ready to grasp at any hope of salvation. One by one, they voiced their support for Bohemond's plan, their objections overcome by desperation and the Norman prince's skillful manipulation. Only Raymond held out, his voice growing increasingly isolated as he argued for honor, for keeping faith with their oaths, for finding some other way. But the good knight could see that the Count was fighting a losing battle. The tide of opinion had turned against him, and even his own supporters were beginning to waver. It was then that Bohemond played his final card. "Of course," he said, his voice casual but his eyes fixed on Raymond. "Such an undertaking would require unified command. We cannot afford the confusion and delay that comes from divided leadership. I propose that whoever leads this assault should be granted lordship over the city when it falls." The tent fell silent. Everyone understood what Bohemond was really saying, that he would not act unless he was guaranteed control of Antioch, regardless of their previous oaths to return it to the Byzantine Empire. Raymond's face flushed with anger. "You would break your oath to the Emperor? You would steal what rightfully belongs to—" "To whom?" Bohemond interrupted. "To an emperor who abandoned us? Who sent his advisor to spy on us and then recalled him when the situation became difficult? Alexios has shown his true colors. We owe him nothing." The argument that followed was bitter and personal, revealing the deep fractures that had been growing within the Crusader leadership for months. Raymond accused Bohemond of treachery and ambition. Bohemond countered with charges of rigidity and impracticality. The other princes found themselves forced to choose sides, their decision complicated by their own exhaustion and desperation. In the end, it was not principle that decided the matter, but fear. The prospect of facing Kerbogha's army in their current condition was simply too terrifying to contemplate. One by one, the princes gave their consent to Bohemond's plan, their voices heavy with reluctance, but their resolve broken by months of suffering. Raymond was the last to speak, his voice barely audible in the sudden quiet of the tent. "I cannot support this," he said. "I will not be party to such betrayal." "Then you condemn us all," Bohemond replied, his voice carrying a note of triumph that he could not quite conceal. As the council broke up, the good knight found himself walking beside Raymond back toward the Count's pavilion. The older man moved like someone who had aged years in the space of a few hours, his shoulders bowed under the weight of his isolation. "I have failed them," Raymond said suddenly. "I have failed the army, failed the emperor, failed the very cause we came here to serve. You have remained true to your principles?" The GoodKnight replied. "That is not failure." Raymond laughed bitterly. "Principles are a luxury we can no longer afford. Bohemond understands that. He sees the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Perhaps that makes him the better leader. Or perhaps it makes him something else entirely." They walked in silence for a while, two men contemplating the ruins of everything they had once believed in. Around them, the camp was stirring with new energy as word of Bohemond's plan spread through the ranks. Men who had been listless with despair now moved with purpose, their faces bright with the hope of finally escaping the trap they had been caught in for so long. But the GoodKnight could see the other side of that hope, the willingness to embrace any solution, no matter how morally questionable, if it promised an end to their suffering. It was a dangerous precedent, one that would echo through the years to come. "What will you do now?" he asked Raymond. The Count was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant walls of Antioch. "What I must," he said finally. "I will not support Bohemond's plan, but neither will I actively oppose it. The army needs unity more than it needs my conscience." It was a compromise that satisfied no one, least of all Raymond himself. But it was the kind of compromise that desperate times demanded, the sort of moral flexibility that allowed good men to survive in an imperfect world. As they reached Raymond's pavilion, the GoodKnight found himself thinking of all the other compromises he had witnessed over the centuries, the small betrayals and moral shortcuts that accumulated over time until they became something larger and more terrible. He had seen empires built on such foundations, and he had seen them crumble when the weight of their contradictions finally became too much to bear. The Siege of Antioch was teaching them all hard lessons about the nature of leadership, about the price of survival, about the thin line that separated pragmatism from corruption. Some would learn those lessons and emerge stronger for the experience. Others would be broken by them, their faith in themselves and their cause shattered beyond repair. And a few, like the GoodKnight himself, would simply endure, carrying the weight of what they had witnessed like a burden that could never be set down. The night was growing late, and around them the camp was settling into the restless sleep of men who knew that great changes were coming. But the GoodKnight remained awake, staring up at the stars and thinking of all the choices that had led them to this moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of character and resolve. And somewhere in the darkness, the wheels of Bohemond's plan were already beginning to turn, setting in motion events that would change not just the fate of Antioch, but the very nature of the Crusade itself. The GoodKnight had seen enough of history to know that such moments were turning points, places where the future balanced on the edge of a knife. Which way it would fall depended on the choices made by fallible men in impossible circumstances. He could only hope that when the reckoning came, there would be something left worth saving. May arrived like a fever dream, bringing with it news that struck the Crusader camp like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Kerbogha of Mosul was on the march, and his army was even larger than the most pessimistic estimates had suggested. 40,000 men, perhaps more, Turks, Arabs, Persians, and Kurds united under the banner of jihad, all of them burning with the desire to drive the Christian invaders back into the sea from whence they had come. 3 days. The man gasped as he was helped from his saddle. Perhaps 4 if the rain slowed them, but no more than that. The GoodKnight felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Not fear, exactly, for he had long ago made his peace with death, but something deeper and more complex. It was the recognition of a moment when history balanced on the edge of a blade, when the actions of a few desperate men would echo through the centuries to come. Around him, the camp erupted into frantic activity. Men who had moved like sleepwalkers for months suddenly found new energy, driven by the knowledge that their time of reckoning had finally arrived. Some began preparing for battle, sharpening weapons that had grown dull with disuse, checking armor that had been patched and repatched until it resembled patchwork quilts more than military equipment. Others began preparing for flight, gathering what few possessions they still owned and eyeing the roads that led back toward the coast. But it was a third group that caught the GoodKnight's attention. The men who gathered around Bohemond's pavilion with the eager intensity of conspirators. These were the ones who knew about the Norman prince's secret plan, who understood that the approaching army might be exactly the catalyst needed to set their desperate scheme in motion. The GoodKnight made his way through the camp toward Bohemond's tent, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who had business to attend to. He had no official role in the prince's inner circle, but the chaos of the moment provided cover for many things that would normally have been impossible. He found Bohemond in conference with a small group of his most trusted knights, their voices low and urgent as they discussed the final details of what they had been planning for weeks. The Norman prince looked different than he had in the council meeting, less theatrical, more focused, like a man who had finally found the moment he had been waiting for. "The timing is perfect," Bohemond was saying as the GoodKnight approached. "Kerbogha's approach will force everyone's hand. They will have to choose between my plan and certain destruction." "And if the Armenian refuses?" asked Tancred, his young face tight with worry. "He won't," Bohemond replied with absolute confidence. "Firuz has as much to lose as any of us. More, perhaps, since he will be the first to die if Kerbogha retakes the city." The GoodKnight felt his blood chill at the mention of the name. Firuz, an Armenian guard who controlled one of the towers in Antioch's northern wall, the man whose betrayal would open the gates that had resisted the Crusader army for 8 long months. It was then that Bohemond noticed the GoodKnight's presence. The prince's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to determine whether this silver-armored knight represented a threat to his carefully laid plans. "You have something to say?" Bohemond asked, his voice carrying a subtle challenge. The GoodKnight met his gaze steadily. "Only that desperate times call for desperate measures, my lord. And that history will judge us all by what we do in the hours to come." Bohemond studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Indeed it will. The question is whether we will be alive to care about history's judgment." It was a fair point, and one that the GoodKnight could not argue with. He had seen enough of war to know that moral purity was a luxury that few could afford when survival was at stake. But he had also seen what happened to men who abandoned their principles entirely, who convinced themselves that any action was justified if it served their immediate needs. The meeting broke up shortly afterward, the conspirators dispersing to make their final preparations. The GoodKnight lingered for a moment, watching as Bohemond studied a crude map of Antioch's defenses, his finger tracing the route that would take them from the Tower of the Two Sisters to the heart of the city. "You disapprove," Bohemond said, without looking up. "I understand necessity," the GoodKnight replied carefully. "But I also understand the price that such necessities exact." Bohemond finally looked up, his blue eyes meeting the GoodKnight's gaze. "And what price is that?" "The part of ourselves that we can never get back." The Norman prince was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, Not the theatrical smile he wore in public, but something smaller and more genuine, tinged with a sadness that the good knight had not expected to see. "Perhaps," Bohemond said softly. "But if the alternative is to watch this army die in the mud of Syria, then I am willing to pay that price." The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. The good knight found himself caught between his duty as a knight and his growing unease about what was to come. He had sworn no oath to Bohemond, owed no allegiance to any particular faction within the army, but he was bound by something deeper, a commitment to the men who would live or die based on the decisions made in the hours ahead. He spent much of his time moving through the camp, observing the mood of the common soldiers, trying to gauge their readiness for what was to come. What he saw troubled him deeply. These were not the same men who had marched so confidently from Constantinople nearly a year ago. They were hollow-eyed scarecrows, held together by little more than desperation and the fading memory of the faith that had brought them so far from home. Some had already begun to desert, slipping away in the night like ghosts fleeing a haunted house. Others spoke openly of surrender, of throwing themselves on Kerbogha's mercy in the hope that he might spare their lives. And still others had retreated so far into themselves that they seemed to be watching events from a great distance, as if they had already died and were merely waiting for their bodies to catch up with their spirits. It was among this last group that the good knight encountered Stephen of Blois. The count was sitting alone outside his pavilion, staring at nothing with the vacant expression of a man who had seen too much and understood too little. His once fine clothes were stained and patched, his face gaunt with hunger and marked by the kind of exhaustion that sleep could not cure. "My lord," the good knight said, approaching carefully. "Are you well?" Stephen looked up, his eyes taking a moment to focus. When they did, the good knight saw something in them that made his heart sink. The look of a man who had already given up, who was simply going through the motions of living while waiting for the end to come. "Well?" Stephen laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I am dying, Sir Knight. We are all dying. The only question is whether we will die quickly in battle or slowly from starvation and disease. Kerbogha's army is still days away." The good knight said. "Much can happen in that time." "Yes," Stephen agreed. "We can all die a little more before the final blow falls." The good knight studied the count's face, seeing in it the reflection of his own fears about what the siege had done to them all. Stephen of Blois had once been a proud nobleman, a man of wealth and influence who had taken the cross with genuine faith and noble intentions. Now he was a broken shell, his spirit crushed by months of hardship and the growing realization that their cause might be doomed. "You speak of surrender," the good knight observed. Stephen's laugh was bitter. "I speak of reality. We are trapped between an impregnable city and an army that outnumbers us 4-1. What would you have us do? Perform miracles?" It was a fair question, and one that the good knight could not answer honestly without revealing knowledge that he was not supposed to possess. Instead, he simply nodded and moved on, leaving Stephen to his despair and his increasingly dark thoughts. But the encounter stayed with him as he continued his rounds through the camp. Stephen of Blois was not the only one who had reached the breaking point. The good knight could see it in faces throughout the army, the slow dissolution of hope, the gradual acceptance of defeat. It was a cancer that was eating away at the very foundations of their cause, and he wondered if even Bohemond's desperate gamble would be enough to stop it. The answer came on the night of June 2nd, when everything finally came together in a convergence of treachery, desperation, and the kind of desperate courage that only emerges when men have nothing left to lose. The good knight was awakened by a hand on his shoulder, gentle but insistent. He opened his eyes to find one of Bohemond's knights standing over him, the man's face barely visible in the darkness. "It is time," the knight whispered. The good knight rose without a word, donning his armor with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done so countless times before. Around him, other figures moved through the darkness. 60 knights, carefully chosen for their skill and their loyalty to Bohemond's cause. They were the spearhead of a plan that would either save the Crusader army or destroy it utterly. They made their way through the camp in small groups, moving like shadows through the maze of tents and sleeping men. The good knight found himself thinking of other night attacks he had participated in over the centuries. Other moments when the fate of armies had hung on the courage of a few desperate men, willing to risk everything on a single throw of the dice. But this felt different somehow. More personal, more morally complex. They were not attacking an enemy fortress through skill and courage, but exploiting the betrayal of a man who had been trusted to defend it. It was effective, perhaps even necessary, but it left a bitter taste that no amount of rationalization could wash away. They reached the base of Antioch's northern wall just as the first pale light of dawn began to appear in the eastern sky. The tower of the Two Sisters loomed above them, its stones dark and forbidding in the pre-dawn gloom. Somewhere up there, Firuz was waiting with a rope ladder and the keys to a city that had resisted them for 8 long months. Bohemond himself led the way up the ladder, his movements quick and sure despite the weight of his armor. The good knight followed close behind, his silver mail catching what little light filtered down from above. One by one, the 60 knights climbed toward their destiny, each man knowing that they were crossing a line from which there could be no return. The tower was dark and silent when they reached the top, but Firuz was there as promised. A small, nervous man whose hands shook as he handed Bohemond the keys to the adjacent towers. The Armenian's face was pale with fear and guilt, but his resolve seemed firm. Whatever had driven him to this betrayal, money, revenge, or simple desperation, it was stronger than his loyalty to the city he had sworn to defend. "The garrison is small," Firuz whispered as they moved through the tower. "Most of the men are sleeping. If you move quickly." He did not need to finish the sentence. They all understood what needed to be done. The next few minutes passed in a blur of violence and confusion. The good knight found himself moving through darkened corridors, his sword singing as it met the hastily raised weapons of Turkish guards who had been caught completely off guard. There was no glory in it, no honor, just the grim necessity of men who had been pushed beyond the limits of civilized warfare. But it was effective. Within minutes, they had secured 3 towers and opened a postern gate that allowed the main Crusader army to pour into the city. The good knight stood on the walls and watched as thousands of Christian warriors flooded through the breach, their faces bright with a savage joy that spoke of months of pent-up frustration and rage. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Turkish garrison, caught completely unprepared, was overwhelmed in minutes. But the killing did not stop there. Fueled by months of suffering and the intoxicating taste of victory, the Crusaders turned on the city's civilian population with a fury that shocked even the good knight, who had seen more than his share of urban warfare. He tried to intervene where he could, using his sword to protect innocent civilians from the worst excesses of his fellow Christians. But he was only one man, and the tide of violence was too strong to be turned by individual action. All he could do was bear witness to what they had all become, and try to save what few lives he could in the chaos that followed. It was during this grim work that he encountered Governor Yaosuyan's final moments. The Turkish commander had been caught trying to flee the city, his horse brought down by Christian arrows just outside the walls. The good knight found him lying in the mud, his life ebbing away from wounds that no physician could heal. Their eyes met for a moment, two warriors who had spent months trying to kill each other, now brought together by the strange intimacy that only shared suffering could create. Yaosian's lips moved, but no sound came out. The good knight knelt beside him, close enough to hear the whispered words, "I defended my city." They were the last words the governor would ever speak, and the good knight found himself oddly moved by them. Here was a man who had done his duty as he understood it, who had fought with skill and courage against overwhelming odds. In another time, another place, the good knight might have called him friend. But this was war, and war made enemies of men who might otherwise have respected each other. The good knight closed Yaosian's eyes and said a quiet prayer for his soul, then rose and continued his grim work of trying to limit the damage that victory had unleashed. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Antioch was in Christian hands. The great city that had resisted them for 8 months had fallen in a single night, brought low not by superior force or brilliant tactics, but by the betrayal of one man and the desperate courage of 60 knights who had been willing to risk everything on a single gamble. But even as the Crusaders celebrated their victory, the good knight could see the seeds of future troubles already beginning to sprout. The city was theirs, but at what cost? And more importantly, what would they do now that they had it? The answer to that question would come sooner than any of them expected, in the form of dust clouds on the horizon that announced the arrival of Kerbogha's massive army. They had won Antioch, but now they would have to hold it against odds that made their previous struggles seem like children's games. The Siege of Antioch was over. The siege of the Crusaders was about to begin. The irony was not lost on the good knight as he stood atop the walls of Antioch, looking out at the vast army that now surrounded the city. For 8 months, they had been the besiegers, slowly starving and freezing in the Syrian mud, while the Turks looked down at them from these very walls. Now, in the space of a single night, the roles had been reversed with a completeness that would have been comical if it had not been so terrifying. Kerbogha's army stretched across the valley like a living carpet, their banners snapping in the morning breeze, their armor glinting in the Syrian sun. 40,000 men, perhaps more, Turks and Arabs, Kurds and Persians, all united in their determination to drive the Christian invaders back into the sea. The good knight had seen many armies in his long existence, but few that radiated such confidence, such certainty of victory. And why should they not be confident? The Crusaders who had taken Antioch were a shadow of the force that had arrived the previous October. Disease and starvation had reduced their numbers by half, and those who remained were hollow-eyed scarecrows held together by little more than desperation and fading faith. They had won the city, but at a cost that left them barely capable of defending it. The good knight turned away from the walls and made his way through the streets of Antioch, observing the chaos that victory had brought. The city was a maze of narrow alleys and ancient buildings, its stones bearing the marks of centuries of conquest and reconquest. Roman columns stood beside Byzantine churches, while Islamic minarets rose above markets that had served traders from across the known world. But now those streets ran red with blood, and the air was thick with smoke from burning buildings. The sack of Antioch had been swift and brutal, fueled by months of pent-up rage and the intoxicating taste of victory after so much suffering. The good knight had tried to limit the worst excesses where he could, but he was only one man against a tide of violence that seemed to have no end. He found Bohemond in what had once been Governor Yaosian's palace, a magnificent building that spoke of the wealth and power that Antioch had once commanded. The Norman prince was holding court in the main hall, surrounded by his knights and advisors, his face flushed with the triumph of his gamble's success. "Ah, Sir Knight!" Bohemond called out as the good knight entered. "Come, join us in our celebration. We have done what many thought impossible. We have taken the strongest city in Syria." The good knight approached slowly, his silver armor catching the light that streamed through the hall's high windows. Around him, the other knights were indeed celebrating, their voices loud with wine and victory. But the good knight could see the underlying tension in their faces, the knowledge that their triumph might prove to be short-lived. "My lord," the good knight said carefully, "Kerbogha's army has arrived. They are already beginning to establish their siege lines." Bohemond's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Let them come. We hold the strongest fortress in the east. Let them break themselves against these walls as we nearly did." It was bravado, and everyone in the hall knew it. The walls of Antioch were indeed strong, but walls were only as good as the men who defended them, and the men who now held Antioch were exhausted, demoralized, and running dangerously low on supplies. "My lord," ventured one of Bohemond's knights, a grizzled veteran named Hugh, "what of food? The city's stores were already low when we took it, and we have thousands of mouths to feed." Bohemond waved dismissively. "We will find food. We always have before." But the good knight could see the doubt in the prince's eyes, the recognition that their situation was perhaps even more desperate now than it had been during the long months of siege. Then at least they had been able to forage in the surrounding countryside. Now they were trapped within the city's walls, with Kerbogha's army controlling everything beyond. The meeting broke up shortly afterward, the knights dispersing to see to their various duties. The good knight lingered for a moment, watching as Bohemond studied a map of the city's defenses, his finger tracing the walls that would either save them or become their tomb. "You think we are doomed," Bohemond said without looking up. "I think we face a test that will require everything we have and more," the good knight replied. Bohemond finally looked up, his blue eyes meeting the good knight's gaze. "You have seen such situations before." It was not a question, and the good knight did not treat it as one. "I have seen cities fall and cities endure. The difference is usually not in the strength of the walls, but in the will of those who defend them." "And what is your assessment of our will?" The good knight considered the question carefully. He had spent the morning moving through the city, observing the mood of the men who would have to hold these walls against Kerbogha's assault. What he had seen was not encouraging. "It is fragile," he said finally. "Victory has given the men hope, but it is a brittle hope. If it breaks," he did not need to finish the sentence. They both understood what would happen if the army's morale collapsed while they were trapped within the city's walls. The first test of that morale came sooner than either of them expected. The good knight was making his rounds along the northern wall when he heard the commotion from the streets below. Shouts and screams echoed off the ancient stones, and he could see people running in all directions with the panicked energy of a disturbed ant-hill. He made his way down from the walls and into the maze of narrow streets, following the sounds of disturbance toward their source. What he found there made his blood run cold. A group of Crusader knights had cornered a family of Syrian Christians in a small courtyard, their swords drawn and their faces twisted with a rage that seemed to have no rational source. The family, a man, his wife, and 2 young children, cowered against a wall, their eyes wide with terror. "Please," the man was saying in broken Latin, "we are Christians. We welcomed you. We helped you." "You look like Turks to me," snarled one of the knights, a young man whose surcoat bore the arms of a minor Norman house. "How do we know you're not spies?" The good knight stepped forward, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "Stand down," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded in many battles. The young knight turned, his face flushed with wine and bloodlust. "Who are you to give me orders?" "Someone who remembers what we came here to do." The good knight replied evenly. "We came to protect Christians, not to slaughter them. These aren't real Christians," another knight protested. "They're heretics, schismatics. They follow the Greek rite." The good knight felt a familiar weariness settle over him. He had heard such arguments before, in other times and places, the way that fear and desperation could twist faith into something ugly and destructive. "They are Christians," he said firmly, "and they are under my protection." The confrontation might have escalated, but at that moment Tancred appeared at the mouth of the alley, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the situation. Bohemond's nephew was young, but he carried himself with the authority of his bloodline and his position within the army's hierarchy. "What is the meaning of this?" Tancred demanded. The knights quickly explained their suspicions, their voices defensive and uncertain. Tancred listened with the patience of a man who had dealt with such situations before, then turned to the good knight. "Your assessment?" "They are what they claim to be," the good knight said. "Syrian Christians who have lived under Turkish rule. They deserve our protection, not our suspicion." Tancred nodded slowly, then turned back to the knights. "Return to your duties. There are real enemies to fight without creating new ones." The knights dispersed reluctantly, their bloodlust unsatisfied, but their obedience to authority intact. The Syrian family remained huddled against the wall, their relief palpable, but their fear still evident. "Thank you," the man whispered to the good knight. "You saved our lives." The good knight helped them to their feet, noting the way the children clung to their parents, with the desperate intensity of those who had seen too much violence for their young years. "Find somewhere safe to hide," he advised. "The city is not secure yet." After the family had gone, Tancred remained behind, his young face troubled by what he had witnessed. "This is not what we came here for," he said quietly. "No," the good knight agreed, "but it is what we have become." It was a harsh truth, but one that could not be avoided. The long siege had changed them all, stripping away the noble ideals that had brought them to the east, and revealing the darker impulses that lay beneath. They were no longer the glorious army of God they had imagined themselves to be, but desperate men capable of terrible things when pushed beyond their limits. The proof of this came over the following days, as reports filtered in of similar incidents throughout the city. Crusader knights turning on Eastern Christians, soldiers looting churches, men who had taken vows of poverty fighting over scraps of gold and silver. The victory that should have united them was instead revealing the deep fractures that ran through their ranks. But it was not just the common soldiers who were showing signs of strain. The good knight observed similar tensions among the leadership, as the reality of their situation began to sink in. He witnessed one such moment during a council meeting in Bohemond's palace, where the princes had gathered to discuss their defense of the city. The meeting had started badly, and only gotten worse as the true scope of their predicament became clear. "We have perhaps a week's worth of food," Raymond of Toulouse was saying, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Maybe less if we cannot find additional supplies. Then we must break out," Godfrey of Bouillon replied. "Fight our way through Kerbogha's lines and retreat to the coast." "With what?" Bohemond demanded. "Half our men can barely stand, and the other half are too busy looting the city to prepare for battle." The argument that followed was bitter and personal, revealing the deep animosities that had been building for months. Raymond accused Bohemond of caring more about his claim to the city than the survival of the army. Bohemond countered that Raymond's rigid adherence to their oaths to the Byzantine emperor was preventing them from taking the decisive action their situation required. The GoodKnight watched this display with growing alarm. These were the men upon whom the entire crusade depended, and they were tearing each other apart at the very moment when unity was most essential. It was then that a messenger arrived with news that silenced the arguing princes and sent a chill through everyone present. Stephen of Blois had deserted the army, fleeing in the night with a small group of followers. But worse than his desertion was what he had done after leaving the city. He intercepted the emperor's relief force. The messenger reported, his voice barely above a whisper. Told them that the army was destroyed, that any rescue attempt would be futile. Alexios has turned back to Constantinople. The silence that followed this announcement was deafening. The GoodKnight could see the impact of the news on every face in the room. The realization that they were now truly alone, cut off from any hope of outside assistance. "So," Bohemond said finally, his voice eerily calm, "we are on our own." It was a statement of fact, but it carried implications that went far beyond the immediate military situation. With the Byzantine emperor's withdrawal, the last pretense of their original mission had been abandoned. They were no longer Crusaders fighting to restore Christian lands to the empire. They were simply desperate men fighting for their lives in a hostile land. The meeting broke up shortly afterward, the princes dispersing to their various duties with the grim efficiency of men who understood that their time was running out. The GoodKnight remained behind, watching as Bohemond stared at his map of the city's defenses with the intensity of a man trying to find salvation in lines drawn on parchment. "What will you do now?" the GoodKnight asked. Bohemond looked up, his blue eyes reflecting a hardness that had not been there in the early days of the siege. "What I must, what we all must. We will hold these walls until we cannot hold them any longer." And then, he did not finish the sentence, but the GoodKnight understood. They would fight until they died, because there was no other choice left to them. As he left the palace and made his way through the darkening streets of Antioch, the GoodKnight found himself thinking of all the other desperate last stands he had witnessed over the centuries. Some had ended in glorious victory against impossible odds. Others had ended in heroic defeat that inspired future generations. But most had simply ended, leaving nothing behind but bones and memories that faded with time. Which fate awaited them in Antioch remained to be seen. But the GoodKnight was beginning to suspect that whatever happened in the days to come would test not just their military skills, but the very essence of what they had become during their long journey from the lands of their birth. The siege of the Crusaders had begun in earnest, and with it would come the final reckoning for all the choices they had made, all the compromises they had accepted, all the prices they had been willing to pay in pursuit of their impossible dream. The hunger returned with a vengeance that made their previous sufferings seem almost gentle by comparison. Within days of Kerbogha's arrival, the food situation in Antioch had become desperate. The city's stores, already depleted by months of siege, were quickly exhausted by the sudden influx of Crusader troops. What little remained was jealously guarded by those strong enough to take it and keep it. The GoodKnight witnessed the first signs of the coming collapse during his morning rounds through the city. In a narrow alley near the Church of St. Peter, he found a group of knights from Normandy fighting over a single loaf of bread. Men who had once shared their wealth freely, now reduced to snarling animals clawing at scraps. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow with the particular madness that comes from prolonged starvation. "It's mine!" one of them was screaming, clutching the bread to his chest like a mother protecting her child. "I found it first!" The others circled him like wolves, their hands on their sword hilts, their noble breeding forgotten in the face of primal need. The GoodKnight stepped forward, his silver armor catching the morning light, and the knights froze at his approach. "My lords," he said quietly, "is this what we have become?" The knight holding the bread looked up at him with eyes that seemed to burn with fever. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I haven't eaten in 3 days. 3 days! I can feel myself dying." The good knight had seen such desperation before, in other sieges, other times when civilized men were reduced to their most basic instincts. But knowing what to expect did not make it easier to witness. "Share it," he said simply. "Break it into pieces and share it among yourselves." "There isn't enough," another knight protested. "There's never enough." But something in the good knight's voice, some quality of authority that transcended rank or title, seemed to reach them. Slowly, reluctantly, they divided the meager loaf among themselves, each man receiving a portion barely large enough to fill a child's palm. As they ate in silence, the good knight found himself thinking of another meal, shared long ago in a different time and place. The memory was distant and painful, but it reminded him of what these men had once been. Knights bound by codes of honor and courtesy, men who would have died before behaving as they had just done. The siege was stripping away everything that made them human, layer by layer, until only the animal core remained, and they had barely begun to feel Kerbogha's pressure. The first serious assault came on June 7th, just 2 days after the Turkish army had completed its encirclement of the city. The good knight was on the eastern wall when the attack began, watching as thousands of Turkish warriors advanced across the valley with the disciplined precision of a well-oiled machine. They came in waves, each one breaking against the ancient stones of Antioch's walls like surf against a rocky shore. The defenders fought with the desperate courage of men who knew that defeat meant death, their arrows and spears taking a terrible toll on the advancing enemy. But the good knight could see that it was a losing battle. For every Turk who fell, 2 more seemed to take his place, while every Christian casualty was irreplaceable. He found himself fighting beside a young knight from Provence, a boy who could not have been more than 16 years old. The youth's face was pale with fear and exhaustion, but his sword arm remained steady as he struck down enemy after enemy who tried to scale the walls. "Will we hold?" the boy asked during a brief lull in the fighting. The good knight looked out at the sea of Turkish banners that surrounded the city, at the endless ranks of fresh troops waiting their turn to assault the walls. "We will hold as long as we can," he said. "That is all any of us can do." It was not the answer the boy had wanted to hear, but it was the only honest one the good knight could give. They were fighting against time as much as against the enemy, hoping that something, anything, would change their desperate situation before their strength finally gave out. The assault continued throughout the day, wave after wave of Turkish warriors throwing themselves against the walls with a ferocity that spoke of their confidence in ultimate victory. The defenders held, but barely, and the good knight could see the toll that the fighting was taking on men who were already weakened by months of hardship. When darkness finally brought an end to the assault, the walls of Antioch were littered with the dead and dying of both sides. The good knight helped carry the wounded to the makeshift hospitals that had been established in various churches throughout the city, his silver armor stained with blood that was not his own. It was during this grim work that he encountered Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate who served as the army's spiritual leader. The bishop was kneeling beside a dying knight, administering the last rites with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the violence that surrounded them. "How many more?" Adhemar asked as the good knight approached with another wounded man. "Too many," the good knight replied. "And this was only the first day." Adhemar nodded slowly, his face grey with exhaustion and something deeper, a spiritual weariness that seemed to weigh on him like a physical burden. "I fear we are being tested beyond our strength," he said quietly. "That God is asking more of us than we can give." It was a shocking admission from a man whose duty was to inspire faith, but the good knight understood. He had seen what prolonged suffering could do to even the strongest believers, how it could erode the foundations of faith until nothing remained but doubt and despair. "Perhaps," the good knight said carefully. "The test is not whether we can endure, but whether we can remain human while we do so." Adhemar looked at him sharply, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You speak strangely for a simple knight. There is wisdom in your words that suggests experience." The good knight said nothing, but the bishop seemed to take his silence as confirmation of something he had suspected. "Yes," Adhemar said slowly. "I thought so. Well then, you understand the weight of what we carry. The knowledge that our actions here will echo through the ages, that we are writing a chapter in the great book of God's plan for humanity." "And what chapter do you think we are writing?" the good knight asked. Adhemar was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dying knight before him. "I pray it is one of redemption," he said finally. "But I fear it may be one of damnation." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the street outside, shouts and running footsteps that spoke of some new crisis. The good knight and Adhemar exchanged glances, then hurried outside to see what was happening. They found a crowd gathered around a man who was speaking with the fevered intensity of a prophet. The good knight recognized him as Peter Bartholomew, a monk who had attached himself to Raymond of Toulouse's household. The man's face was flushed with excitement, his eyes bright with the kind of fervor that could be either divine inspiration or simple madness. "I have seen him!" Peter was shouting. "St. Andrew himself appeared to me in a vision, as real as any of you standing here. He has shown me where the Holy Lance lies hidden, the very spear that pierced our Saviour's side." The crowd murmured with excitement and skepticism in equal measure. The good knight had heard such claims before, in other desperate times, other moments when men grasped at any hope of divine intervention. Sometimes such visions were genuine. More often, they were the products of minds pushed beyond their limits by suffering and desperation. But genuine or not, the good knight could see the effect that Peter's words were having on the crowd. Men who had been hollow-eyed with despair were suddenly standing straighter, their faces bright with renewed hope. In their desperate situation, even the possibility of divine aid was enough to rekindle the faith that had brought them so far from home. Adhemar, however, was less impressed. The bishop pushed through the crowd, his face stern with disapproval. "Enough of this nonsense," he said firmly. "We have real problems to deal with without chasing after phantom relics." But Peter was not to be deterred. "It is no phantom, Your Grace. St. Andrew showed me the exact spot, beneath the altar of the Church of St. Peter. The lance waits there for us to claim it, to use it as a weapon against our enemies." The argument that followed was fierce, but brief. Adhemar's skepticism was matched by the desperate hope of men who had nothing left to lose. In the end, it was Raymond of Toulouse who settled the matter, his voice carrying the authority of rank and desperation in equal measure. "We will search," he declared. "If the lance is there, we will find it. If not, we will know that this man is a fraud." The excavation began the next morning, with Peter Bartholomew directing a team of diggers in the Church of St. Peter. The good knight was among the observers who gathered to watch, drawn by curiosity and the faint hope that perhaps, just perhaps, divine intervention might save them from their desperate situation. The work proceeded slowly. hampered by the rocky ground beneath the church's ancient stones. Hour after hour, the diggers labored while Peter urged them on with increasing desperation. The GoodKnight could see doubt beginning to creep into the faces of the watchers as the day wore on without result. It was near sunset when the cry went up. One of the diggers had struck something metallic, and within minutes they had unearthed a spear point, ancient, corroded, but unmistakably real. Peter Bartholomew fell to his knees beside the excavation, tears streaming down his face as he proclaimed the fulfillment of his vision. The effect on the watching crowd was immediate and electric. Men who had been on the verge of despair suddenly found their voices, shouting prayers and praises to God. The news spread through the city like wildfire, and within hours the entire Crusader army was buzzing with excitement about the miraculous discovery. The GoodKnight watched this transformation with mixed feelings. He had seen enough of human nature to know that the spear point could have been placed there by Peter himself or by one of his supporters. But he had also seen enough of divine intervention to know that God sometimes worked through the most unlikely instruments. More importantly, he could see what the discovery was doing for the army's morale. Men who had been ready to surrender were suddenly talking of victory. Knights who had been too weak to lift their swords were finding new strength in their faith. Whether the lance was genuine or not, it was having a very real effect on the defenders of Antioch. But not everyone was convinced. The GoodKnight encountered Bohemond later that evening, and the Norman prince's skepticism was evident in every line of his face. "You believe in this miracle?" Bohemond asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I believe in its effect," the GoodKnight replied. "Whether it is genuine or not may be less important than what it does for our men's spirits." Bohemond nodded slowly. "A pragmatic view. I find myself thinking the same thing. If this relic can give our men the courage to fight, then perhaps its authenticity is beside the point." It was a cynical assessment, but the GoodKnight could not argue with its logic. They were fighting for their lives, and any weapon, physical or spiritual, that might help them survive was worth using. The proof of the lance's power came over the following days as the army's transformation continued. Men who had been listless with despair suddenly found energy for the tasks of defense. Knights who had been quarreling over scraps of food began sharing what little they had. The discovery had given them something that had been missing for months: hope. But the GoodKnight also noticed the divisions that the lance was creating. Adhemar remained skeptical, his doubts shared by many of the clergy and some of the more educated nobles. They saw Peter Bartholomew as a fraud, the lance as a clever deception designed to manipulate the desperate masses. The controversy came to a head during a council meeting in Bohemond's palace, where the princes gathered to discuss their next move. The lance lay on a table in the center of the room, its ancient metal gleaming in the lamplight, while the assembled nobles debated its significance. "It is a fake," Adhemar declared, his voice heavy with conviction. "A piece of metal planted by a charlatan to deceive the faithful." "Can you prove that?" Raymond demanded, his hand resting protectively near the relic. "Can you prove that God did not guide us to this sacred weapon?" The argument that followed revealed the deep fractures that ran through the Crusader leadership. Some, like Raymond, embraced the lance as a sign of divine favor. Others, like Adhemar and Bohemond, remained skeptical of its authenticity. Still others seemed to care less about its genuineness than about its practical effects on the army's morale. The GoodKnight listened to this debate with growing unease. The lance was supposed to unite them, to give them strength for the battles ahead. Instead, it was becoming another source of division, another wedge driven between men who needed to stand together if they were to survive. But perhaps that too was part of the test they were facing. Perhaps the true miracle was not the discovery of an ancient relic, but the way that desperate men could find hope in the darkest of circumstances, even if that hope was built on foundations of sand. As the meeting broke up, and the princes dispersed to their various duties, the good knight remained behind, staring at the lance and thinking of all the other relics he had seen over the centuries, some genuine, some false, all of them invested with the hopes and fears of those who believed in their power. In the end, he realized, it did not matter whether the lance was real or not. What mattered was what it represented, the refusal to surrender, the determination to fight on even when defeat seemed certain, the stubborn human insistence that there must be something beyond the darkness that surrounded them. Whether that something was divine intervention or simple human courage, the good knight could not say. But he knew that they would need every scrap of both if they were to survive the trials that lay ahead. The Siege of Antioch was entering its final phase, and with it would come the ultimate test of everything they had become during their long journey from the lands of their birth. The lance would either save them or damn them, but either way, it would reveal the truth about what they were truly made of when stripped of everything but their most basic humanity. June 28th dawned grey and oppressive, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press down upon the city like the weight of divine judgment. The good knight stood on the walls of Antioch in the pre-dawn darkness, watching as Kerbogha's vast army stirred to life in their camps beyond the walls. 40,000 men, perhaps more, all of them fresh and well-fed, while the defenders of the city had been reduced to walking skeletons, sustained by little more than desperation and the fragile hope embodied in an ancient spear point. The decision had been made the night before, in a council meeting that had stretched long into the darkness. They would sortie from the city, all of them, every man capable of bearing arms, in one final desperate gamble. It was madness by any rational calculation. They were outnumbered 4-1, weakened by months of starvation, their horses so few that most would fight on foot. But the alternative was to remain trapped within the walls until they died of hunger or disease, and that was a fate none of them could accept. The good knight had listened to the debate with the detached interest of someone who had witnessed similar councils in other desperate times. The arguments were always the same, the cautious voices urging patience, the bold ones demanding action, the desperate ones grasping at any hope of salvation. In the end, it always came down to the same choice: die fighting or die cowering. For men who had taken the cross and marched thousands of miles from home, there was really no choice at all. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the eastern sky, the good knight made his way through the narrow streets of Antioch toward the church of St. Peter, where the army was gathering for what might be their final service. The city was eerily quiet, its usual bustle replaced by the hushed tension of men preparing for battle. In doorways and windows, he could see the faces of civilians, Syrian Christians, Armenian merchants, Greek clergy, all of them watching with the hollow eyes of people who understood that their fate would be decided in the hours to come. The church was packed beyond capacity, knights and men-at-arms crowding together in a space meant for a fraction of their number. At the altar, Adhemar of Le Puy was conducting Mass, his voice carrying clearly through the vaulted space, despite the weakness that had been growing in him for weeks. The papal legate was dying. Everyone could see it, but he had insisted on blessing the army one final time before they rode out to meet their destiny. The good knight found a place near the back of the church, his silver armor dulled by months of wear, but still catching what little light filtered through the ancient windows. Around him, men who had once been proud nobles and wealthy merchants knelt in the dust like penitents, their faces gaunt with hunger but bright with the kind of fervor that only comes when death is near. The Holy Lance stood beside the altar, its ancient metal gleaming in the candlelight. Whether it was genuine or not, and the GoodKnight still had his doubts, it had transformed the army in ways that seemed almost miraculous. Men who had been ready to surrender were now eager to fight. Knights who had been too weak to stand were finding strength they had not known they possessed. The relic had given them something that no amount of food or reinforcements could provide: the belief that God was on their side. "Deus vult!" the congregation chanted, their voices rising to fill the ancient stones with sound. "God wills it." The words echoed off the walls like a prayer and a battle cry combined. And the GoodKnight found himself thinking of all the other times he had heard those same words, in other churches, other armies, other moments when desperate men had convinced themselves that their cause was righteous and their victory assured. Sometimes they had been right. More often, they had been wrong. But right or wrong, the words had power, and power was what they needed now more than anything else. After the service, the army began to form up in the streets outside the church. It was a pathetic sight by any objective measure. Perhaps 15,000 men, most of them on foot, their armor patched and their weapons worn from months of use. But there was something in their bearing, some quality of determination that transcended their physical weakness, that reminded the GoodKnight of why he had chosen to fight alongside them in the first place. He found his place in the formation beside a group of knights from Normandy, men he had fought with during the long months of siege. They greeted him with the easy camaraderie of soldiers who had shared hardship and danger, their faces grim but resolute. "Think we'll see another sunset?" asked one of them, a grizzled veteran named Robert, whose scarred face spoke of many battles. "Does it matter?" replied another, a younger man whose noble bearing had been worn down to its essential core by months of suffering. "We die here or we die in there. At least this way we die fighting." The GoodKnight said nothing, but he understood their mood. These were not men going to their deaths in despair, but warriors who had found peace with their fate. They had been tested beyond the limits of human endurance and had discovered something unbreakable at their core. Whether they lived or died in the hours to come, they would do so as men, not as the broken creatures they had been in danger of becoming. The gates of Antioch opened with a grinding of ancient hinges that seemed to echo across the valley like thunder. The GoodKnight felt his destrier, one of the few horses that had survived the siege, shift beneath him, sensing the tension in the air. Around him, the army began to move forward with the slow, inexorable pace of men who understood that there was no turning back. They emerged from the city in 4 divisions, each one led by a different prince. Bohemond commanded the vanguard, his golden hair catching the morning light as he rode at the head of his Norman knights. Raymond of Toulouse led the 2nd division, the Holy Lance carried before him like a banner. Godfrey of Bouillon commanded the 3rd, his steady presence a source of strength for the men who followed him. And bringing up the rear was Tancred, young but proven in battle, his face set with the determination of a man who had found his purpose. The GoodKnight rode with Raymond's division, close enough to see the lance as it swayed with the movement of its bearer. The relic seemed to glow in the morning light, whether from some divine radiance or simply the reflection of the sun off its ancient metal. But its effect on the men around him was undeniable. They rode straighter, their voices stronger, their eyes bright with the kind of faith that could move mountains. Kerbogha's army was waiting for them in the valley beyond the city, their ranks stretching from horizon to horizon like a living sea of steel and silk. The Turkish commander had positioned his forces with the skill of a master tactician, his cavalry on the flanks, his infantry in the center, his archers ready to rain death upon the advancing Christians. It was a textbook deployment, the kind that military scholars would study for centuries to come. But as the good knight studied the enemy formation, he began to notice something that gave him hope. The Turkish army was not moving with the unified purpose he had expected. There were gaps in their lines, hesitation in their movements, the subtle signs of an army that was not entirely united in its purpose. Kerbogha commanded a vast host, but it was a host made up of many different factions, each with their own agendas and ambitions. The charge, when it came, was unlike anything the good knight had experienced in all his centuries of warfare. Not because of its violence, he had seen plenty of that, but because of its desperation and its strange, transcendent beauty. 15,000 men, most of them on foot, hurling themselves against an army nearly 3 times their size, with the kind of reckless courage that could only come from men who had nothing left to lose. The good knight found himself in the front rank as the two armies collided, his sword singing as it met the curved blade of a Turkish emir. Around him, the battle dissolved into the familiar chaos of individual combats, each man fighting his own private war against death and defeat. But there was something different about this fight, something that set it apart from all the others he had participated in. It was the sound, not the clash of weapons or the screams of the wounded, but something deeper and more primal. The sound of men who had been pushed beyond their limits and had discovered reserves of strength they had never known they possessed. They fought not with the mechanical efficiency of professional soldiers, but with the desperate fury of men defending everything they held sacred. The good knight's opponent was skilled, his scimitar moving with the fluid grace of a master swordsman. But there was something in the Turk's eyes that the good knight recognized. Doubt. This was not the easy victory that Kerbogha's army had expected. These starving, desperate Christians were fighting with a ferocity that defied all rational explanation, and that ferocity was beginning to have an effect on their enemies. The psychological impact spread through the Turkish ranks like wildfire. These were men who had come expecting to face a broken army, demoralized troops who would flee at the first sign of serious resistance. Instead, they found themselves confronting warriors who fought with the fury of the damned, who seemed to draw strength from their very desperation. The good knight saw it first in the eyes of the emir he was fighting. A flicker of uncertainty, a moment of doubt. The man had expected his opponent to be weak, easily defeated. Instead, he found himself facing a knight whose silver armor seemed to glow with its own inner light, whose sword moved with the precision of centuries of experience. The doubt spread. As doubt always did in battle, one man's hesitation became another's fear, and fear became panic. The good knight watched as sections of the Turkish line began to waver, then break, then flee in disorder. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, but once it began, it spread with the inexorable force of an avalanche. Kerbogha himself tried to rally his troops, his voice carrying across the battlefield as he exhorted his men to stand firm. But the psychological damage was already done. His army had been built on the assumption of easy victory, and when that assumption proved false, the entire structure began to collapse. The rout, when it came, was sudden and complete. One moment the Turkish army was a disciplined force advancing to certain victory. The next, it was a mob of fleeing horsemen, their confidence shattered by the unexpected resilience of their supposedly beaten enemies. Even the garrison in Antioch's citadel, seeing the disaster unfolding below, surrendered rather than face the wrath of the victorious Christians. The good knight found himself standing in the aftermath of the battle, his sword still in his hand, his silver armor stained with blood that was not his own. Around him, the field was littered with the debris of war, broken weapons, abandoned banners, The bodies of men who had died far from home in pursuit of dreams they would never see fulfilled. But it was not the carnage that held his attention. It was the faces of his fellow Crusaders, the men who had somehow, impossibly, snatched victory from the jaws of certain defeat. They stood like men awakening from a dream, unable to quite believe what they had accomplished. They had faced an army 4 times their size, and had not merely survived, they had won. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the good knight had witnessed in all his long existence. It was not the wild revelry of soldiers drunk on victory, but something deeper and more profound. The quiet joy of men who had discovered something unbreakable within themselves. They had been tested in the Crucible of Antioch and had emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. As the sun set over the valley where so much blood had been spilled, the good knight found himself thinking of all the battles he had fought, all the sieges he had endured, all the moments when the fate of kingdoms had hung in the balance. But this one felt different somehow, more personal, more complete in its transformation of everyone who had participated in it. The Siege of Antioch was over, but its effects would echo through the centuries to come. The men who had endured it would carry its lessons with them for the rest of their lives, and those lessons would shape not just their own destinies, but the destiny of the entire crusading movement. Some would remember it as a glorious victory, a triumph of faith over adversity. Others would remember it as a cautionary tale about the price of ambition and the dangers of pushing men beyond their limits. But all would remember it as the moment when they discovered what they were truly made of when everything else was stripped away. The good knight removed his helm and looked up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. They were the same stars that had shone over other battlefields, other sieges, other moments when the course of history had been decided by the courage or cowardice of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. He had survived Antioch, as he had survived so many other trials. But survival, he now understood, was not the same as victory. Victory was what happened when men found the strength to remain human in the face of inhuman circumstances, when they discovered that there were some things worth dying for, and more importantly, worth living for. The road to Jerusalem lay open before them now, but the good knight knew that the real journey, the journey of the soul, was far from over. The Crucible of Antioch had refined them all, burning away the dross to reveal the essential metal beneath. What they would do with that refined essence, how they would use the lessons they had learned, remained to be seen. But for now, in this moment of quiet triumph, it was enough to know that they had endured. They had faced the darkness and had not been consumed by it. They had discovered that even in the depths of despair, hope could survive, and that even the most desperate gamble could sometimes pay off. The good knight sheathed his sword and began the long walk back to the city, its silver armor catching the starlight as he moved through the shadows of history. Behind him, the battlefield lay silent, except for the whispered prayers of the dying and the distant sound of celebration from the walls of Antioch. The siege was over. The crusade would continue. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, new trials awaited. Trials that would test them in ways they could not yet imagine, that would demand sacrifices they were not yet prepared to make. But they would face those trials as they had faced this one, together, united by bonds forged in the crucible of shared suffering, strengthened by the knowledge that they had already survived the worst that fate could throw at them. The good knight had seen the best and worst of human nature during the long months of siege. He had witnessed betrayal and heroism, despair and hope, the slow dissolution of everything that made men civilized, and the stubborn refusal to surrender that made them human. It had been a journey into the heart of darkness, but also a journey towards the light. And in the end, perhaps that was what the Siege of Antioch had really been about. Not the capture of a city or the advancement of a cause, but the discovery of what lay at the core of the human spirit when everything else was burned away. They had found that core, had tested it, had proven it unbreakable. Now they would carry that knowledge with them as they continued their impossible journey toward the holy city, toward whatever destiny awaited them in the lands beyond. The GoodKnight would be with them, as he had always been, bearing witness to their struggles and their triumphs, their failures and their redemptions, for that was his burden and his privilege. To endure, to remember, to carry the stories of mortal men through the endless corridors of time. The Siege of Antioch would become legend, its lessons passed down through generations of warriors and pilgrims, scholars and dreamers. But for those who had lived through it, who had felt the weight of its trials and the joy of its ultimate triumph, it would always be something more than legend. It would be the moment when they discovered who they truly were, when they learned that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could find a way to shine. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the dreams and fears of mortal men. But the men themselves were not indifferent. They had been changed by what they had experienced, refined by suffering, strengthened by adversity. They would carry those changes with them wherever they went, whatever they did, for the rest of their lives. The GoodKnight walked on through the darkness, his silver armor a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed devoid of it. Behind him lay the past, with all its trials and tribulations. Ahead lay the future, uncertain but no longer hopeless. The Siege of Antioch was over. The legend of Antioch had just begun.